blood crusted black under Nayeli's fingernails, and she lay dying on the salt flats the very morning that would change her life, though she had no way of knowing it yet, and neither did the rancher riding toward her without any idea what he was about to find. 3 days earlier, a raid had burned her family's rancheria to embers and made her the one witness a powerful man wanted silenced before sundown. By the next sunrise, the man who saved her would have 300 Chiricahua warriors standing in a silent line above his ranch, and the whole shape of his life rewritten inside a single day. This is Arizona territory. In the late summer of 1876, in the dry basin country east of the Dragoon Mountains, where the ground cracks itself into 1,000 white plates under a sun that shows no mercy to anyone, settler or Apache, guilty or innocent. By that year, the Chiricahua bands who called those mountains home had already spent a decade watching their world narrow, treaty by treaty, agent by agent, each promise of protected land quietly redrawn the moment a rancher or mining company. Chloe's people were not wanderers without a country, whatever the newspapers in Tucson liked to print. They moved with the seasons through a range they had known for longer than any settler's grandfather had been alive, following water and game between the high country and the basin floor, the way their families had for generations, and Chloe himself had spent half his adult life in careful, exhausting negotiation with agents, trading patience for peace whenever peace could still be had, because he had watched what happened to bands led by men too proud to trade anything at all. 3 days before that morning, Nayeli had been kneeling in a wash below her family's camp, cutting devil's claw root for her father's medicine bag, when she heard the first gunshot and understood, the way a person understands weather before it arrives, that her whole world had just ended. She was 22 years old, the daughter of Plahwa, a non-tin of standing among the Chiricahua bands scattered through those mountains, a man known as much for his skill at healing as for his skill at leading, which in that country was rarer and more valuable than either alone. Nayeli had grown up at his side learning the names of plants and the shapes of wounds, the color a fever turned a person's tongue, the way a snake bite swelled different from a scorpion sting, the particular bitter smell of a wound gone bad that meant a fever would follow within a day. She had learned, too, the quieter parts of her father's work, how to sit with a frightened patient long enough for the fear itself to loosen its grip, how a person healed faster when they believed someone competent was paying attention to them, a lesson that would matter more to her own future than she could have guessed at 22. She remembered her sunrise ceremony 4 years back, 4 days of dancing and blessing under her mother's careful watch, remembered feeling for the first time in her life like the whole camp was holding her future gently in its hands. She had grown up, too, watching the treaty lines on government maps creep closer to their water every season, watching men like Agent Percival Loomis ride in with soft promises in hard paper, watching her father sign what he had to sign to keep his people fed through one more winter. The gunfire that morning had not come from soldiers. It came from a dozen riders in plain range. Clothes, no uniforms, no flag, moving fast and shooting into the wickiups before anyone inside had a chance to understand what was happening. Nayeli froze in the wash for exactly as long as it took her mother's voice to reach her, screaming her name, ordering her to run and not look back, to reach the Sulphur Springs band and bring help. She ran because her mother told her to, and because some instinct older than fear warned her that if the raiders caught her too, no one outside those mountains would ever learn what had happened at that camp, and the men responsible would simply ride away clean, the way men like that usually did. She never made it to the Sulphur Springs band. She lost the trail in the dark on the second night, twisted her ankle badly on the third, and by the fourth morning, delirious with thirst, she wandered instead onto the flat white nothing of the salt basin, where there was no water for 20 miles in any direction and no shade at all, and where a young woman with a fever and a swollen ankle and 3 days of running behind her stood roughly the same odds as a match dropped in a windstorm. She had done everything right, by the measure of everything her father and her aunts had taught her about surviving open country. She had traveled at night when she could, and rested in whatever shade a rock outcrop offered by day. She had chewed the pulp of a barrel cactus for what little moisture it gave up. She had covered her trail twice, doubling back through a dry wash the way Clawa had shown her as a girl, certain for a while that it had worked, that no one, friend or enemy, would find her out there. What none of her training had prepared her for was the particular grinding math of the salt flats themselves, ground so flat and so white it offered a person nothing to hide behind and nothing to drink, mile after mile of it, until even her carefully rationed good sense finally gave out somewhere in the blinding middle of the fourth day. What she carried with her from the raid, before the running started, was one clear memory. A raider had pulled back his bandana to shout an order, and in that half a second, with her mother's scream still hanging in the air, Nayeli had seen his face plainly enough to know it again anywhere. A puckered white scar ran from his left ear down into his collar, the kind of scar a knife left, not an accident. She had seen that scar before, in town on the foreman who rode for the Bar C, spread west of the mountains, a man named Colby, who worked for a rancher named Silas Cutter. Months earlier, Cutter had stood in the trading post doorway and told her father plainly that the whole valley would be better off without Apache cattle drinking Apache water on land that belonged, in his words, to men who'd actually improve it. Nayeli did not yet understand what Cutter's foreman leading a raid on her family's camp could mean beyond simple cruelty. She would come to understand it fully soon enough, and by then it would very nearly get her killed a second time. Wyatt Calder had not gone looking for any of this. He rode out onto the edge of the salt flats that morning for the plainest reason a rancher in that country ever had. Chasing 4 head of cattle that had wandered off looking for water they weren't going to find out there, and he was 2 hours into a bad-tempered search when he spotted what he first took for a fallen fence post half sunk in white ground. A mile off, shimmering in heat, the way everything shimmered past 9 in the morning. He was 31, unmarried, and had been running the Calder spread alone on Sweetwater Creek since his father died of a fever 2 winters back, and his younger brother took the family's share of what little money there was and headed west for the mining camps, leaving Wyatt the land, the debt, and not much else to show for either. His brother's last letter, 8 months old by then, and folded soft at the creases from being read too many times, had promised he'd send money home as soon as his claim paid out, a promise Wyatt had stopped believing somewhere around the 6th month without ever quite admitting that to himself. Running 200 head of cattle alone, with only Ezra for help, on a spread that hadn't turned a real profit in 3 years, had a way of narrowing a man's world down to weather and water and debt, and Wyatt had more or less accepted by that summer that this narrowed life was simply what his life was going to be. He was not a romantic man by his own accounting. He had buried both his parents before he turned 25 and had learned early that the desert rewarded a man's caution, not his sentiment that a heart left to run ahead of good sense out here tended to end up dead, or else deep in debt to Silas Cutter, who had spent 2 quiet years buying up half the small spreads along Sweetwater Creek, one bad season at a time, and who wanted Wyatt's water rights badly enough to have already sent a man twice to ask politely whether Wyatt had reconsidered selling. Wyatt had reconsidered it exactly as much as he'd reconsidered giving away his own teeth. But riding out toward what he still believed was a fence post, none of that was on his mind. What was on his mind, once he got close enough to see the shape, wasn't a post, but a person, face down in white dust, with black hair fanned out around her head like something spilled, was that any sensible man would probably turn his horse around. A lone Apache woman found half dead on open ground, days after gossip had already started moving through Sable Wells about trouble somewhere east of the Dragoons, was not a situation a cautious rancher wanted any part of. He'd heard the talk in town the day before, vague and ugly. Men saying there'd been a raid. Other men saying Apaches had done the raiding. Nobody quite sure. everybody ready to believe whichever version let them feel less afraid of their neighbors. He got down off his horse anyway. She was alive, though, only barely, her breathing shallow and fast, her lips cracked white, and when he rolled her gently onto her back, she didn't stir, didn't so much as flinch, which frightened him worse than anything else could have. He had exactly 1 canteen and about 4 miles. Between himself and his own well, he made the only choice that felt like a choice at all, which was also, though he didn't think of it in those terms yet, the choice that would end up rewriting the rest of his life. He tipped a slow trickle of water past her cracked lips, waited until her throat moved to swallow it, and then lifted her up in front of him on the saddle, wrapped her as best he could against the horse's heat, and rode for home at a pace that would have half killed a lesser animal. Some debts get paid back. Plain coin for coin, favor for favor. This one was never going to work that way, and Wyatt had no way of knowing it yet, but the woman slumped unconscious against his chest was about to become the reason 300 armed Chiricahua warriors would ride down out of the mountains 2 mornings later and hold a silent line along the ridge above his ranch, close enough for him to count them. Close enough that every man in Sable Wells would spend the rest of that week telling the story of the morning war finally came to Sweetwater Creek. It very nearly did. It just didn't come the way anybody expected. Back at the ranch, Wyatt did the only things he knew how to do for a fever that bad cool cloths, slow water, a real bed instead of the bunkhouse floor, and a long night spent listening to her breathe in case the breathing ever stopped. His hired hand, a sun-cured older man named Ezra Poole, who had worked the Calder spread since before Wyatt was born, took one look at the unconscious woman laid out in the good bed and told him flatly he'd lost his mind. Bringing an Apache woman into his house during a summer when half the county was already jumpy about raiders was, in Ezra's frank opinion, the worst idea Wyatt had had since he tried breaking that black stallion 2 years back and spent a week flat on his back for the trouble. "She'd have been dead by noon," was all Wyatt had to offer, which was true, and not really an answer to what Ezra was actually asking. Ezra grumbled and fetched more water anyway, because whatever else he thought about the wisdom of it, he wasn't a man who could listen to somebody die of thirst in the next room and do nothing. Nayeli's fever broke before dawn on the 2nd day, and she came up out of it slowly, aware first of cool cloth against her forehead, then the smell of wood smoke and coffee, then a low male voice somewhere close, careful and unhurried, and it took her a moment to realize the voice was talking to a horse outside the window rather than to her. When she finally opened her eyes all the way, it took a longer moment to place where she was, and a much shorter one to understand she was in a settler's house, in a settler's bed, entirely at a settler's mercy, and every instinct she owned told her to be afraid. Wyatt, finding her awake and rigid against the headboard when he came in, had the sense not to close the distance too fast. He set a cup of water and a plate with a heel of bread and some dried meat on the table beside the bed, well within her reach, and stepped back near the door, hands loose at his sides. "You don't owe me a word," was the whole of what he offered her, not a question demanding an answer she might not want to give. "Water's clean. Bread's fresh this morning. I'll be out at the barn if you need anything." Then he left, which struck Nayeli, much later, as one of the smartest things any stranger had ever done for her, though in the moment all she felt was disbelief and a wariness that didn't loosen even after she drained the cup and eaten every scrap on the plate. Because kindness from a white rancher was not a thing her 3 days on the salt flats had taught her to trust. If you're the kind of viewer who likes to see trust earned the hard way, this next stretch is for you. Tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. It's a small thing that helps this frontier channel keep going every week. It took 2 more days before Nayeli spoke to him at length, and even then, in short, careful sentences, in English better than Wyatt expected and worse than her own, learned mostly from a mission school teacher who'd once passed through her mother's camp trading lessons for goat's milk. She gave him her name. She admitted eventually that there had been a raid, that her family's camp was gone, that she didn't yet know who among her people had lived and who hadn't, and that saying anything more than that to a stranger whose skin marked him as belonging to the same general kind of person who had burned her home, Wyatt didn't push. He buried enough of his own family by then to recognize grief sitting across the table, refusing to eat, and he understood in a rough way that pressing a person to talk before they were ready rarely got you the truth, it only got you the version they thought you wanted to hear. So he kept doing small, useful things. Instead, he fixed a proper splint for her ankle out of a barrel stave and a strip of canvas. He kept Ezra from hovering with his rifle every time she left the bedroom. He rode into Sable Wells for supplies and came home having said nothing to anyone about who was recovering out at his place, which was, given how fast talk traveled through that town, close to a miracle, and one that didn't last. It didn't last because Reese Colby had men watching the roads. Colby had known, within a day of the raid, that one member of the family camp hadn't been accounted for among the dead, and he'd heard from a rider who'd gotten close enough before she ran that the missing woman had likely seen his face. Silas Cutter did not tolerate loose ends, particularly not a loose end who could put a rope around his foreman's neck and drag Cutter's own name into a federal inquiry along with it. So for 3 days, Colby's men had quietly asked questions at every ranch and trading post within 30 miles. On the 4th day, one of them heard from a talkative freight driver that Wyatt Calder had ridden into town looking unusually grim and had bought twice his normal order of bandages and salt. That same evening, word of an entirely different kind reached Clawa's camp, carried by a Sulphur Springs scout who'd crossed the tail end of Nayeli's exhausted trail 3 days earlier and had only now pieced together whose footprints they were. Clawa had spent those days doing the hardest thing a father and a leader could do at once, burying half his camp and organizing search parties for the other half. And when word came that his daughter might be alive and tended at a settler's ranch on Sweetwater Creek, he did not know whether to feel hope or a fresh, sharper kind of dread. Settlers had lied about worse before. Some had used exactly that story, a supposedly cared-for Apache woman, to lure warriors into an ambush. Clawa decided the way he decided most things, carefully, answering to no one's judgment but his own. He would ride out and see with his own eyes. He would not go alone, and he would not go pretending to be smaller than what he was. He sent word that evening to the other Chiricahua bands within reach, not as a call to war but as a plain statement of fact, that his daughter might be alive, that he intended to find out for certain, and that any family who wished to ride with him was welcome to. By the following dawn, warriors from 3 separate camps had gathered at the base of the mountains, men and women who had lost relatives of their own to raids and broken promises over the years, and who understood without needing the reason explained twice. Exactly why a father might need 300 witnesses at his back before he knocked on a stranger's door. In the meantime, life on the Calder ranch settled into a careful, watchful rhythm that neither Wyatt nor Nayeli quite trusted yet. She was up and moving within 4 days, favoring the ankle, but stubborn about it, and Wyatt caught her the first morning, trying to help Ezra move a feed sack she had no business lifting, and rather than scold her, which he suspected wouldn't land well with a woman who'd survived what she had, he simply handed her the lighter end and let her carry it. It was a small thing, it told her something true about him anyway, that he wasn't a man who needed her helpless to feel useful himself. Sable Wells was the kind of town that existed, mostly because a stage line and a mining supply route happened to cross there. A single, dusty main street with a mercantile, a livery, a saloon, and a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays. Home to perhaps 200 souls who all knew each other's business a good deal better than any of them would have liked. Word of the recovering Apache woman had already leaked past Ezra's silence and Wyatt's careful trips to town, and by the end of that first week, a few of the harder-edged voices in Sable Wells had started muttering about it openly at the saloon and the feed store, wondering aloud whether Calder had gone soft in the head. whether he understood what he was risking, bringing one of them into his house at a time like this. A man named Purdy, who ran the livery and had never much liked Wyatt to begin with, made a point of saying it loud enough for Wyatt to hear on his next supply run that decent folks ought to think twice about doing business with a man harboring Apaches after what half the county was hearing about a raid gone the other way. Wyatt didn't argue with him. He paid for his goods, loaded his wagon, and rode home, and if his jaw was set tighter than usual that evening, he didn't say why, and Nayeli, watching him unload the wagon in silence, understood exactly what kind of talk a man carried home with him without ever repeating it out loud. Dawn on the third morning after Wyatt found her, Nayeli was sitting on the porch step working through the stiffness in her ankle when she saw the first shapes appear along the ridge above the creek. Dark against a sky just starting to go, the color of a bruise healing. She stood too fast, pain forgotten, heart slamming, because even before she could make out faces or markings, she recognized the particular economy of Chiricahua riders sitting a horse, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 6 days finally, impossibly, began to loosen. Wyatt came out of the barn at a run rifle already in hand because he'd seen them too, and what met his eyes in the gray early light was a line of mounted men stretching the whole ridge above his property. More riders gathered in one place than he had ever seen in his life, sitting motionless and silent, watching his house. "Get inside," he said, low and urgent, already moving to put himself between her and the ridge, and it did not occur to him until much later how strange that instinct must have looked, a settler rancher trying to shield an Apache woman from Apache warriors. In that moment he understood only danger, and a woman he'd spent 3 nights keeping alive, and something in him had already decided, without asking his permission, which side of this he intended to stand on. Nayeli didn't move. "Wait," she said, and something in her voice stopped him cold. Something that wasn't fear at all. Ezra came out onto the porch with his own rifle half raised, muttering about the very trouble he'd warned Wyatt this would bring, and for one long minute the whole ranch held still. 3 armed white men and 1 Apache woman on a porch, 300 mounted warriors on the ridge above. The only sound, the wind moving through the cottonwoods along the creek, and a rooster crowing somewhere with complete indifference to the fact that a small war might be about to start in his front yard. Then the line on the ridge parted, and a single rider came down alone, unhurried, a man in his 50s with iron-gray hair bound back, and a bearing that made it obvious, even at that distance, that he was not simply one more warrior among many. He carried no weapon raised. He rode that slope at a walk in full view of 3 loaded rifles, which was either the bravest thing Wyatt had ever watched a man do or the most reckless. And only later did Wyatt understand it was neither. That it was simply what confidence looked like in a man who already knew how this morning would end, and was giving the frightened people below him the courtesy of learning it slowly instead of all at once. "Father," Nayeli breathed, and was off the porch before anyone could stop her, splinted ankle, forgotten entirely, moving down toward the approaching rider, and Wyatt watched his own rifle lower almost of its own accord as the gray-haired man swung down before his horse had fully stopped, gathering his daughter up against him with both arms. For a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because some kinds of relief don't have words attached to them in any language. "Lower your weapons," Wyatt told Ezra, and set his own down against the porch post, because whatever this was, it had stopped being a thing that needed guns about 10 seconds earlier. Clawa held his daughter at arm's length, studying her face, the fading bruises, the careful way she still favored her ankle, something in his composed features cracking open just slightly with the effort of not weeping in front of 300 of his people. Then his eyes moved past her to the 2 white men on the porch, with their rifles finally lowered, and his expression settled back into something unreadable and formidable. He asked her, in their own language, low and quick, what had happened, and she told him everything: the water, the bread, the 3 days of fever, the man who had carried her 4 miles on horseback, rather than leave her where she lay. Lawa listened without interrupting, his eyes flicking once to Wyatt and back. Then he walked up to the porch alone, leaving the line of warriors motionless on the ridge behind him, close enough now for Wyatt to see the deep lines weathered into his face and the calm, appraising intelligence behind his eyes. He stopped a few feet away and studied Wyatt for a long moment before he spoke, an English worn smooth by years of dealing with agents and soldiers and traitors, chosen carefully, the way a man chooses which of his tools to bring to a job. "You found my daughter dying," Clawa said. "You gave her water instead of a bullet. You did not sell her, and you did not touch her, and you did not send for soldiers to collect a reward for finding a lost Apache woman. I know this, because if you had done any of it, I would already know, and this conversation would look very different." Wyatt didn't quite know what to say to that. Any decent man would have done the same, he managed, the kind of thing men in that country said when they didn't want to seem to be claiming credit for basic humanity, though both of them understood standing there that plenty of decent-seeming men in that valley would not have done the same at all, not for an Apache woman. Not with the town's current mood running as hot as it was about raiders, perhaps, Clawa allowed, but you are the one who did it. He glanced back once at the ridge, then to Wyatt again. "You have been afraid we came for vengeance. I understand why. There has been enough given on both sides of this valley to be afraid of for a long time now. We did not come for vengeance against you. We came because a father does not sleep while his daughter is missing, and because 300 of my people wished to see for themselves whether the story reaching us was true. It is true. That changes what is owed here and what is not." The word owed sat uneasily in the morning air, and Wyatt felt the whole shape of the situation shift under him, because up to that point he'd believed, plainly, that he'd done a decent thing for a dying stranger and expected nothing further to come of it beyond her quiet recovery and eventual departure. He hadn't accounted for the fact that in Nayeli's world, an act like his didn't simply evaporate once performed. It created a thread between two people, and possibly between two peoples, and threads like that carried weight whether either side wanted them to or not. Ezra, standing just behind Wyatt's shoulder with his rifle, finally lowered all the way, muttered under his breath that he'd never in his life seen a man argue this hard against being thanked, which was near enough to true that Wyatt didn't bother denying it. "I don't want anything owed to me," Wyatt said, and meant it. "I did what needed doing. She's welcome to go home with you today, healthy as she came in, and we can call the whole thing settled." Something shifted in Clawa's expression. Not quite a smile, closer to consideration. "That is the correct answer," he said. "It is also not entirely my decision to make, nor yours alone. Her ankle is not strong enough yet for 4 days through mountain country. She stays here to finish healing under my people's watch as much as yours, and when she is strong enough to choose freely where she wishes to go, she will choose it. That is not a debt, Mr. Calder. That is simply what her body requires, and I trust you understand the difference." It was, Wyatt would understand only much later, an extraordinarily careful piece of diplomacy, a father giving his daughter room to make her own choice about a man who had saved her life, without forcing her toward him out of obligation or away from him out of suspicion, and doing it in front of 300 witnesses so that no one in either community could later claim the arrangement had been anything but honorable on all sides. The warriors did not simply vanish back into the mountains after that. A dozen of them, at Clawa's direction, made camp a respectful half-mile from Wyatt's ranch, close enough to watch and to help if help was needed, far enough not to crowd a household that wasn't theirs. For the rest of that week, Sable Wells buzzed with a story that grew wilder with every telling, an Apache siege, a hostage crisis, a coming war, none of it much resembling the truth, which was quieter and stranger, and to anyone who actually witnessed it, considerably more remarkable than any of the rumors flying around the saloon. It was during that week, with her father's warriors camped nearby, and her ankle mending, and her grief for the family lost in the raid still raw and largely unspoken, that Nayeli and Wyatt settled into something neither of them had a proper name for yet. She started helping around the ranch almost as soon as she could stand without wincing, not because anyone asked her to, but because sitting idle while other people worked had never once in her life felt natural. Wyatt, watching her competently splint a lamb's broken leg on her second day up and about, using half the techniques he'd used on her own ankle days earlier, began to understand that the woman he'd carried home half dead was not someone who needed rescuing so much as someone who'd simply run out of options during one terrible week. They talked slowly, in the evenings, sitting on the porch step with a respectful distance between them, neither of them quite closed, and neither of them quite wanted to. She described her mother who hadn't survived the raid, and the years spent learning medicine at her father's side, and a world of seasonal camps and mountain passes, and an intricate map of relationships between bands that most settlers in that valley had never bothered to learn existed. He described his own parents, the brother who'd left for the mining camps and hadn't written in 8 months, a ranch failing slow and quiet under debt even before any of this happened, and a man named Silas Cutter, who kept sending polite offers to buy him out. Some evenings Estee and 2 or 3 others from the camp down the creek walked up to share a fire with Ezra and Wyatt, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable in Sable Wells a month earlier, and that neither camp treated as anything unusual at all. Nayeli taught Wyatt which of the wild plants along the creek bank were worth harvesting and which would make a grown man sick within the hour, and took a plain private satisfaction in how carefully he wrote her instructions down in a battered notebook he'd otherwise used only for tallying cattle. Wyatt in turn showed her how he read weather in the shape of clouds over the dragoons, a settler's trick she found less useful than her own people's methods, but never said so unkindly. Ezra, for his part, stopped grumbling about the whole arrangement sometime around the 2nd week, mostly because Estee had taken a genuine interest in his stories about breaking horses, and had turned out to be better at gentling a nervous colt than Ezra himself, a fact the old man found almost impossible to admit out loud and repeated to anyone who'd listen. Anyway, at the mention of Cutter's name, Nayeli went very still. "Cutter's foreman led the raid on my family's camp," she admitted. "The first time she'd said the words plainly to anyone but her father. I saw his face. I know it was him." Wyatt sat with that a long moment, something cold settling in his stomach, because he'd spent 2 years assuming Cutter's interest in his own water rights was simple greed, ugly but ordinary, the kind of thing a rancher lived with and grumbled about. What Nayeli described was something else entirely, a man willing to burn a camp and kill families to clear Apache bands off land he wanted, sending his foreman to do it wearing no colors and no badge so it could be blamed on anyone at all. Raiders, rustlers, bad luck, anything but Silas Cutter. "If that's true," Wyatt said slowly, "and Cutter finds out you can put his foreman at that camp, he's not going to let it sit." "I know," was all she said back. She was right to be afraid of exactly that, and within 4 days, Reese Colby's men found out precisely where she was. It happened on a hot, still afternoon that started ordinarily enough. Wyatt out mending fence along the north pasture, Nayeli in the kitchen garden with Clawa's youngest scout, a sharp-eyed young warrior named Estee, assigned by her father to stay close while her ankle was still weak, teaching her which of the settlers' vegetables were worth the water it took to grow them in that country. Estee heard the riders first, a low drum of hooves moving fast and wrong, too many horses moving, with too much purpose for anyone, simply passing through. "Down," he warned, and pulled her behind the garden wall a bare 2 seconds before the first shot cracked the afternoon apart. Colby had brought 8 men, more than sufficient by his own reckoning to deal with 1 rancher, 1 hired hand, and whatever small Apache escort he assumed had mostly ridden back to the mountains by now, not knowing that a dozen warriors were camped a half-mile off and would hear gunfire on Wyatt's land inside a minute and come at a dead run. Colby's plan had never accounted for how thoroughly he'd misjudged the situation, both in numbers and in the character of the man whose ranch he was riding onto. Wyatt heard the shots from the north pasture and was running for the house before the second volley finished, cutting across open ground with his heart hammering and nothing but a mending hammer in his hand until he reached the barn and the rifle kept there. What he found rounding the corner of the house was chaos, already sorting itself into something like order. Ice-T had gotten Nayeli into the root cellar and was returning fire from the garden wall with a steadiness that belied how young he was. Ezra had taken up a position at the bunkhouse window, making Colby's men pay for every foot of ground they tried to cross. From the ridge above, Clawa's warriors were already pouring down at a full gallop, having heard the first shots and understood immediately, without needing to be told, exactly what was happening, and exactly what they meant to do about it. The Apache riders came down that slope in a wide practice sweep, half of them peeling off to cut Colby's men from their horses, the rest closing on the ranch itself. At the front of that second group rode a woman named Zoe, one of the camp's most respected warriors, who had ridden with Clawa's raiding and defense parties for a dozen years and had earned that place the same way. Every warrior in that camp earned it, through skill nobody could argue with. It was Sosie's rifle that pinned down the last of Colby's men trying to flank the barn, giving Ezra the room he needed to fall back to better cover, and it was not lost on Wyatt, watching all of it unfold from the porch with his own rifle raised, that the fight tipping decisively in his favor that afternoon owed as much to a woman he'd never been introduced to as it did to anything he or Ezra managed on their own. It was not, in the end, a long fight, though it felt endless to everyone caught inside it. Colby's men had ridden in, expecting an easy strike against a lone rancher, and had instead run straight into a defended ranch with an Apache war party closing on their flank within 3 minutes, and the arithmetic of that situation became plain to most of them almost at once. 2 of Colby's riders went down in the first exchange. The rest broke and ran the moment the warriors crested the near ridge, all but Colby himself, who made the mistake of turning to fire one last shot at the house rather than run, and paid for it with an arrow through his shoulder that put him on the ground, disarmed and bound inside a minute, and very much alive, and very much talking. Once Clawa's men had him on his knees about who had sent him and why. Wyatt reached Nayeli at the root cellar with his heart still slamming, finding her unhurt, pale, furious rather than frightened, already climbing back out to help however she could. Something in his face when he saw she was whole made her reach for his hand without either of them quite deciding to, and hold it hard enough to leave marks, and neither of them let go for a long while after the shooting had entirely stopped. If any part of you is rooting for these two, become a channel member and tap join beside the channel name. It truly helps this small channel keep telling stories like theirs. Colby, bound and bleeding, and no longer inclined to protect a man who hadn't bothered to come collect him himself, gave Clawa and the territorial marshal, sent for at speed once the fighting stopped, everything they needed. Silas Cutter had ordered the raid on Clawa's camp specifically to clear the band off land bordering Sweetwater Creek, land he meant to file claim on the moment the Apache presence there could plausibly be reported abandoned, and Cutter had further ordered Colby to find and silence any witness who could connect him to it, which was precisely why 8 armed men had ridden onto a peaceful rancher's property in broad daylight to kill an unarmed woman still recovering from a fever. It took the marshal 2 more days to ride out to the Bar C and arrest Cutter, who did not go quietly and did not, in the end, escape the noose his own greed had built for him, tried that autumn on testimony from his own foreman, from Nayeli, and from a rancher named Wyatt Calder, who stood up in a territorial courtroom full of skeptical white settlers and told them plainly and without apology exactly what kind of man Silas Cutter had turned out to be, and exactly what he'd been willing to do to keep his land dealings quiet. Nayeli's testimony was, by every account of that trial, the piece that mattered most, and it was not an easy thing for her to give. Apache testimony had rarely, in that territory, carried any real weight in a white courtroom, and Cutter's lawyer worked hard to remind the jury of that fact every chance he got, questioning her memory, her motives, even her right to be believed at all. She answered every question calmly, in the same unhurried English she'd used with Wyatt those first careful days at the ranch, describing the scar on Colby's neck and the sound of her mother's voice with a precision that left less room for doubt than the lawyer had hoped for. Calder sat in the gallery through every session, saying nothing, needing to say nothing, because his daughter had already said everything that needed saying, and by the third day even some of the settlers who'd come expecting to watch an Apache woman get quietly dismissed had begun, grudgingly, to lean forward and listen. But that trial was still weeks off. In the days right after the attack on the ranch, something quieter and more important was happening between two people who had been circling each other carefully for nearly 2 weeks and had just watched each other fight, side by side, for something worth fighting for. Calder did not miss it. Fathers rarely do. He watched his daughter sit with Wyatt on that porch step each evening, watched the distance between them shrink by careful inches, watched the particular way Nayeli had begun laughing again, something she hadn't done at all in the raw week after the raid, and he understood. With the same clear-eyed patience that had carried him through 30 years of difficult decisions, that this was not a thing that needed his interference so much as his blessing when the time came for it. That time came on a warm evening, near the end of summer, 3 weeks after Wyatt had first carried a dying woman 4 miles across open desert on the strength of nothing but his own conscience. Nayeli's ankle had healed clean. The Apache camp a half-mile off had settled into something almost permanent, families visiting back and forth between the two properties, Isti teaching Ezra's grandsons to read rabbit sign in the dirt, Wyatt learning, slowly and badly, a handful of Chiricahua words that made Nayeli laugh every time he mangled them. Much to his own confusion, that a whole line of Apache riders paid their trading accounts on time and in full, a fact that did more to quiet the ugly talk in town than any speech could have. She found Wyatt at the corral that evening, mending the same stretch of fence he'd been working the day Colby's men attacked, and stood beside him a while without either of them saying anything, watching the light go gold and then rose over the mountains where her people had lived for longer than anyone could count. "I've had 3 offers to go back," she said eventually. "Permanently my father would welcome it. There's a place for me there always." Wyatt set down the hammer. "I know. You should do what's right for you, whatever that is." "I know I should," she said, something careful and unsteady in her voice that made him turn and look at her fully. "I keep trying to make myself want that more than I want this. It isn't working." He didn't answer right away, some part of him afraid that saying the wrong thing now would lose whatever this was, before it had a chance to become what it clearly wanted to become. And instead, he reached for her hand, the same hand she'd gripped so hard in the chaos after the attack, and this time, neither of them let go for a much longer while. "I'm not asking you to choose between your people and me," he said finally. "I don't think that's a fair thing to ask anybody. Your father's camped a half-mile from my front door, and I've never once thought of that as a problem worth solving. He knows that," she said. "He's told me more than once that whatever I choose, it won't cost me my place among my own people. That was never going to be the condition." She looked up at him. "The condition, if there's one at all, is only that whoever I choose has to actually see me. Not the story of me. Not the Apache woman you pulled off the salt flats, and not some tame version of me that fits easier into a town like Sable Wells. Me, I've been trying to do exactly that since the second morning," Wyatt said. "It hasn't been hard. You made it easy." What happened between them after that was quiet and unhurried and entirely their own, the kind of moment that belongs to two people and nobody else, and by the time full dark had come down over Sweetwater Creek, something had been settled between them that neither one needed to say aloud to know was true. Clawa gave his blessing 3 days later, not because his daughter needed his permission, but because a marriage between his family and a settler rancher in that particular valley, at that particular moment, coming so soon after a corrupt landowner had tried to have her killed to cover up a massacre, needed to be seen clearly by everyone in that country for exactly what it was, a choice made freely, in the open, by a woman whose courage had already saved her own life once, and whose testimony would soon help send a murderer to the gallows. The wedding, at the very end of that autumn, was unlike anything Sable Wells had seen before, or would see again for a long while. It took place at the ranch, under the cottonwoods along Sweetwater Creek, with Clawa himself presiding over the Chiricahua portion of the ceremony in soft gray early light, marking the union with rites that belonged to Nayeli's people, rites Wyatt watched with careful, humble attention, understanding he was a guest in something sacred and treating it as exactly that. A circuit preacher, sent for from the county seat, performed a second, shorter ceremony afterward, for the sake of the territorial marriage license and the handful of Wyatt's own kin who'd traveled in for the occasion, and if the pairing of the two ceremonies struck anyone as strange, nobody present was foolish enough to say so, because by then most of Sable Wells had heard the whole story, the raid, the rescue, the ambush, the trial, and had come, grudgingly in some cases and warmly in most, to understand that whatever this marriage was, it hadn't been built on anybody's pity. Ice-T stood as close as family that day, having spent 3 months teaching Wyatt more Chiricahua than the man would ever admit to knowing in town, and Ezra, gruff as ever, allowed that it was in the end probably the smartest, reckless thing Wyatt Calder had ever done, right after riding out onto the salt flats in the first place. They built a life on Sweetwater Creek that neither of them could have predicted the morning Wyatt first mistook a dying woman for a fallen fence post shimmering in the heat. The ranch prospered, helped along by a partnership between Wyatt's cattle sense and Clawa's people's deep knowledge of that country's water and weather, knowledge no government survey had ever bothered to ask for, and that turned out to be worth more than gold to a struggling spread trying to survive the dry years. Nayeli became, over time, something like what her father had been to his own people, a healer whose reputation crossed the old lines between settler and Apache entirely, called out at all hours to tend a fevered child in town or a sick calf on a neighboring ranch with the same unhurried competence. Until the woman half the valley had once whispered about as a stranger to fear became, instead, the person half the valley trusted most when things went badly wrong. The years that followed were not without hardship, drought seasons that tested every partnership on Sweetwater Creek, a government agent or two who eyed the arrangement between the Calder Ranch and Clawa's camp with open suspicion, a handful of townsfolk who never fully warmed to it no matter how many years passed. There was a hard winter 5 years in, when a fresh outbreak of measles swept through both the town and the mountain camps at once, and it was Nayeli, working alongside a settler doctor who had once refused to shake her father's hand, who kept the death count in Sable Wells lower than in towns twice its size. Tending Apache and settler children with the same unhurried competence, until even Purdy, at the livery, who had lost a niece to the same outbreak elsewhere, stopped by the ranch that spring with a crate of good tools as thanks and never spoke an unkind word about the Calder household again. But the arrangement held, season after season, because it had never been built on anything as fragile as everyone's approval. 2 daughters were born to Wyatt and Nayeli in the years that followed, both given Chiricahua names by their grandfather and settler names. For the territorial ledgers, both raised knowing the creek and the mountains equally, taught by their mother to read plants and by their father to read cattle, without either one ever quite saying it in so many words, that the line people in that valley liked to draw between one kind of family and another was a good deal thinner and more foolish than most folks wanted to admit. Clawa lived long enough to see his granddaughters grow past the age. Nayeli had been the summer of the raid, long enough to watch the partnership between his people and the Calder Ranch outlast 3 different Indian agents and 1 territorial governor, and he never once, in all those years, let his daughter forget that the choice had been hers alone to make. Really, the morning she stood at that corral fence and told a rancher the truth about what she wanted instead of what seemed sensible, Esty, for his part, grew into the kind of warrior his elders had always suspected he would, steady and sharp-eyed, and it was a source of quiet pride to Ezra, who never had children of his own, that the young man who'd once pulled Nayeli behind a garden wall came back, year after year, to sit at the old man's fire and hear one more story about breaking horses. Tezoe rode with Clawa's people for another 2 decades after that summer, training a new generation of scouts and warriors along the way, and more than one of Wyatt and Nayeli's own grandchildren grew up hearing, in exacting and slightly exaggerated detail, exactly how she had pinned down a raider's flank with nothing but a borrowed rifle and better ground than he had. The Bar C, stripped of Cutter's ill-gotten claims after the trial, was broken up and sold off in smaller, honest parcels, several of them eventually bought by families, both settler and Chiricahua, who had watched what happened at Sweetwater Creek and decided that whatever kind of valley they wanted to raise their own children in, it looked a good deal more like Wyatt and Nayeli's than like Silas Cutter's ever had. And on quiet evenings, once the work was done and the light went gold over the mountains, Wyatt and Nayeli still sat together on that same porch step where a father had once walked down alone to take the measure of a stranger, and neither of them ever forgot how close the whole story had come to going differently. One canteen, one moment where a sensible man could have turned his horse around and didn't. If this story found its way to you today, tap join beside the channel name and become a channel member. It helps this small channel keep making more. There is a version of this story, the easy version, where a rescue is simple, where a stranger appears out of nowhere and fixes everything and asks for nothing in return, and where gratitude alone is enough to build a marriage on. That was never quite what happened at Sweetwater Creek. What happened was harder and slower, and in the end, a great deal more honest. A woman who nearly died, refusing to be defined by her worst week. A father who protected his daughter's right to choose her own future, even when every instinct told him to pull her home. And a rancher who discovered that the bravest thing he'd ever done wasn't riding toward danger. It was simply choosing not to look away from a person who needed help, and then choosing, every day after that, to keep seeing her clearly for exactly who she was. If you made it this far with us, thank you for staying. If a story like this one is worth an hour of your evening, it's worth sharing with somebody who'd love it too. And if you want more frontier stories like Nayeli and Wyatt's, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you in the next story.